There is a buzz in India about and around the world about India as the fastest growing large country on the planet. And this growth is going to only accelerate and get better and better. But today's story is not about that. Today's story is about the billion people outside the gate who live in India. And these billion people matter because India is not one country. India is like a UK, like an Australia, like a Kazakhstan, and a Nigeria, and Middle Eastern country all rolled into one. I moved to India in 2004 based on this insight when I realized that all the problems that need to be solved are problems that the other 5 billion people face on this planet. And if you actually solve these problems in India, then you actually solve the problems for the rest of the planet. So to me, India is the sharp end of the stick, and where most of the revolutions we are talking about are going to be born. And another thing that moved me back to India is this story in front of you. So a month back, there was this research paper published that for the last 2 decades, hundreds of children have been dying in Bihar for reasons unknown, and they found they're dying because they've been eating lychees. And no, the lychees were not contaminated. The lychees were fine. The same lychees that we might have eaten. But the reason is that these children were eating lychees on an empty stomach because they had no other food. And this had never happened anywhere else in the world. And this happens to approximately 200 million people every day. They go to bed extremely hungry. 750 million people do not get 3 square meals a day. They are slightly malnourished. And as a result, 2.5 million people pass away every year because of hunger. And this problem is not just for the hungry. This problem goes all the way to about 1.2 billion people. Only about 80 million of us constitute 90% of India's disposable income. 90%. The other 1.2 billion get to share 10% of the remaining disposable income. So if you take college engineers, we produce a lot of engineers. And I'm not even talking about liberal arts majors who have literally no jobs. 60% of all our college majors do not get jobs. And the story goes on and on and on. And this story caused me to choose to play a role as a technologist where I moved to India to listen to the problems, to understand the problems and solve the problems. Now we actually think we know, and what I'm discovering, and I'm still just barely scratching the surface, is that I really do not know what the problems are and what needs to be done. I'll give you a simple example. I started an experiment in 2010 when I started getting angry. Probably for the last 6 years after return to India, I've been angry at people who are, working as drivers and maids and other labor jobs who don't do a good job. They don't seem to care, and there's a little bit of not wanting to do better and so on. And I started investigating that and realized that one of the problems is that they are not as well fed as I am, because most of them only get 1 meal a day. So I started this experiment of eating only once a day. The next 6 months and 1 year were very, very tough on me. I started getting angry for no reason. I started yelling at my kids for no reason. I started doing things which I didn't think a good person should be doing. And then I realized that when we, make judgments on a billion people and we try to create systems based on those judgments, right, most of the things we create are flawed. So understanding of the problem itself is missing in many of the technology creators, including me. Change is coming. Silicon is starting to think. About 4 years back, we crossed the computing power of a mouse in the little phone that's in front of you. And all that means is that from a cognitive point of view, most tasks that require a half a second of thinking can now be automated and are being automated. If you go to Google image search and you give a picture of a bridge and say, find me a bridge, it will find all kinds of bridges. Not based on the text, but actually by looking at the images of a bridge. And so on and so forth. And we are now moving towards the computing power of the human mind. Whether or not we reach there, whether or not we can actually solve all human computing problems, all human cognitive problems is irrelevant, because most work on the planet only requires less than 3 or 4 seconds of continuous thinking. And we will probably get there within the next 5 years. And the result of that is manufacturing is disappearing as a job. Manufacturing is accelerating as an enterprise and disappearing as a job. The result of that is that household work will disappear, even in third world countries, even in a place like India. If you take an automated car automated, sweeping and vacuuming device, machines that take care of pretty much all of your house, including making rotis for you. The total cost of all of that, if you actually put it on a 10-year, EMI or a 10-year mortgage, is less than what you would pay a maid and a driver. And that's approximately 12 million to 15 million jobs that would be wiped out just by that alone. And if it's happening in the household, it's definitely happening in the services sector, in the factories. Those little orange robots you see out there are not in the US, they're in India. They whir to life as soon as you press a buy button on Amazon or Flipkart and so on. These robots go to work. And these robots are now 10x cheaper than they were 10 years ago. There is no service enterprise where the low end and the mechanical parts of the job like checkout counters and accounting and so on is not disappearing. And people think that this is only automated or repetitive and not so smart jobs. You have to think again. Most of the sports feeds that you see, most of the quarterly reports feeds that you see on financial services are automatically generated. They are not written by a person anymore. A lot of the commercial art that you might have seen was not touched by a human hand. The story goes on, and here's the reality of it for India. The World Bank, in a collaboration with the Brookings Institute, came up with the conclusion this year, 5 months ago, that 69% of all of India's jobs will disappear in the next 15 years. And it's happening now. And let me give you an example of white-collar jobs, which we've all been celebrating for the last decade. Infosys this year, instead of hiring the usual 16,000, 17,000 people, only hired 5,600. And in addition, it also eliminated 9,000 jobs due to automation by its own press release, which means it reduced its workforce by 3,000 of this 199,000 people they employ. And at the same time, they kept up a healthy growth rate of 9% revenue year over year. And according to their guidance, they're actually accelerating. My guess is because of automation. So, and this story is going to play out and continue again and again. And this is not just an India story, it's a global story. We're going to lose 250 million knowledge workers or so in the next couple of decades. So that leaves the question, a billion people have been living outside the gate since forever, and looks like nothing we do is going to change that, and all this technology we are talking about is actually going to make it worse. It will, unless we do something about it and unless we commit to this problem, right? And so I'm a roboticist by training. I was a roboticist when it was not fashionable to be one. I got my PhD in robotics in 1997, as I think I was the 60th person on the planet to get one of these arcane degrees that nobody cared about. And the reason I did that is this one insight, that India and countries like India cannot solve problems unless we actually have automation. So automation is not an evil, it's a necessity. So these 5 billion people who are invisible, on whose shoulders our lives have been built, if you actually want to create a life for them that is as free and as interesting as life is for us, the only avenue is automation and robotics and all these other technologies that we are talking about. So let me give you concrete data. To give the quality of healthcare, not like US quality, but Canadian quality healthcare, to all of Indian citizens will cost us approximately $2.5 trillion, more than India's GDP. And the only way out is these disruptive technologies which are coming, which will eliminate the necessity for a doctor. And we need to eliminate the necessity for a doctor because we have one doctor for every 2,500 people. And in countries in the West, you have one doctor for every 100. So we are not going to cross this bridge by generating more doctors because we can't even train that many doctors. The only way out is to automate it. Same thing is happening in education. We all heard about edX and Khan Academy. There is this little startup called EkStep, which is being born in Bangalore. And its vision is to create an educational technology which allows the illiterate mother to actually teach the child using this technology. So you have this leapfrog where illiterate people can teach other people to be literate, and then you solve the problem because there is no other way. In India, we will actually have enough teachers to even mentor, let alone teach, all of the children that need to be taught, 25 million of whom are being born every year. And once you actually teach the basics, the more enterprising, the more curious kids will soar, and the Ramanujans and C.V. Ramans and Boses who are now suppressed will rise again, right? And the same thing goes for farming. Our farming is extremely inefficient, probably the least productive in any large economy. It needs to be far more productive to not just to feed us, but also to save water. And the way we are going to do that is with automation. One of my colleagues and friends, Rob Stoner, who's heading the MIT lab for development, which Tata Trust funded, made this comment that he went to Africa and said, look, guys, it's actually easier for me to just pay the farmers to sit nothing and do nothing and sit on the side and let the robots take over and do the job. And it does make sense. So this infinity era, I like to call it. I call it the infinity era for a reason, because it's the era of infinite productivity. Our productivity growth will continue to accelerate, and we are at a point where our productivity rise every year is just about the growth of our economy, which means we are seeing jobless growth. And this productivity is going to exponentially accelerate. When it does, right, we'll actually see declining of jobs. But it also has two more reasons why we are having this conversation today. Infinity will also mean that it has infinity reach. So in the era of infinite productivity, we'll also have infinite reach, which means the innovations we create will touch 1.3 billion people, then 5 billion people, not just the 80 million people who can afford it. And the pace of innovation will also accelerate. So all of this together, I like to call it the infinity era. It has a fundamentally profound impact on our economy. Economy will go from being resources plus capital plus labor to having the last part struck out, and economy will go to resources plus capital plus invention. So all you need to power the economy is invention and resources and capital. Resources, actually we have far more resources than we realize. We just waste a lot of it. So we think we are short of resources, but we are not. And capital, there is the seeming myth that India and emerging countries are short of capital, and I'll address that in a minute with an idea. And inventors, we just have to let them loose. And we are not doing so. I'm not being glib about it. India generates some of probably the most powerful inventors anywhere. Nano fabric that was just revealed a few days back, which can literally filter out salt particles from water at the molecular level, had one of the principal investigators was an Indian scientist. So almost any major innovation on the planet, there is some in that lab somewhere, there is an Indian scientist or a researcher involved. But very little of that is happening here, and we need to solve that. But before that, we need to solve the capital problem. And it so happens that the land we are standing on, just 50% capitalized, 50% turned into capital, would release $4 trillion of capital for India. And we struggle for $100 billion every year. $4 trillion we could unlock, and I'm not kidding you. And this statistic is, it's half of what India's private land is. And the US, the reason why US is so capital rich is US capitalizes approximately 60% of its land. We don't. And that's all we need to do. And to do that, we need to do two things. We need to have high quality maps. Fortunately, we have that. And we also need to make our land dematerialized so that we can actually trade land like how we trade stock. Technology is not the problem, policy is the problem. And policy requires willpower, because in land hides most of our corruption in the country. So we have this country of billion people behind the gates, and we have our innovators behind gates, and we have our entrepreneurs behind gates. To me, India is not just 1.3 billion people, it's also a land of 80 million entrepreneurs, big and small. And the same way as in the 1930s and 40s, America, showed up on the stage, global stage, and became an industrial powerhouse. I believe that our 80 million entrepreneurs being connected to 7 billion people on the planet, just being connected digitally to 7 billion people on the planet, will be a planetary event. And it is happening right now. In the next 3 years, these 80 million entrepreneurs will be connected, and when they are, they will change the world. And some of that, is happening right now. Here's a picture of a small yarn factory somewhere in India. I won't reveal the name because he chooses to be silent. This person has repeatedly, every 10 years, increased his productivity factor of 2, and he continues to do that. He's one of India's better exporters, but he has friction in the way, governance friction, which is something that we need to work on. And I talked about inventors. One of the things that stops inventors from inventing for a billion people is this notion that, who is going to buy my invention? Because there are only 80 million people of us, and I call these 80 million people California Indians because we behave no differently than my friends in California. And The other billion people, the government of India is the only buyer. So for a billion people, there is only one single buyer, and unless we disrupt that buying process, we are never going to have innovation for a billion people. And to do that, I'll give you some examples of what I mean. So up there on your upper left is this little device that one of these young people I work with has built, which turns sewage and wet waste garbage into gas and manure. And one of the innovations he has done is he's miniaturized it. He can actually now do it at a large apartment building size, and I'm pushing him to do it to the 16 apartment building size, so you can have this small device about this footprint, which can be embedded in the basement and can turn manure and can create manure and gas from sewage. Not only do you solve the sewage problem, you actually solve the hygiene problem, because most of our sanitization issues comes from sewage flowing in the open. Now, unfortunately, now it's cheap enough that you can actually have this ROI, have this become cash flow positive within 18 months. His problem is he doesn't know how to sell it, because all the government tenders that come out ask for large-scale sewage processing plants. So this requires a lot more than innovation. Innovation to disrupt and actually transform the planet requires a lot more than coming up with invention. You have to come up with the invention, and then you have to stick to it. And I want to say that we have no idea. So you take the best technologies in the world and you ask them, what are the technologies we need to focus on to solve X? If anybody says they know, they're lying, because I for sure don't. Just to give an example, 2 days ago, there's a report came out that this little known operating system called Android, which was born 5 years ago, has overtaken this monopoly built by this large company, Microsoft, for over 2 or 3 decades, as the most connected operating system on the planet. The more Android devices connect to the internet than Microsoft devices. And we just heard the Tesla story. 1997, before the dot-com boom, this hybrid came out called Toyota Prius, and now Tesla has overtaken all of the Priuses that were ever sold. So India is solving these problems at a very interesting scale and a very interesting way. And I see a lot of hope because of this slide in front of you. We call it the India Stack, and you'll hear more about that. It started with Aadhaar, a biometric way to identify and uniquely pinpoint who you are when you identify yourself. And on top of that, we're building a whole bunch of technologies, a payment interface, a e-signature interface, a digital locker to take your e-signed documents and store it, and so on and so forth. And all of this is to solve one singular problem for the billion people. It is to deliver services to individuals and make sure when they are delivered, they have been delivered, because the receiver identifies and acknowledges that they have received. And when you do that, you solve corruption. In one single shot, this movement alone that India is undertaking will have hiccups. We will figure out problems along the way, but within 10 years, we'll solve corruption. And here's why. The 5% number of corruption you heard about, where 5% of the world's GDP is diverted towards corruption, most of that is coming out of the services that are supposed to be delivered for the bottom of the pyramid. Because these are the voiceless, these are the people who don't fight back. If somebody stole $1,000 from you, might not mean much to you, but you will fight back and you will recover it. When somebody steals $1,000 from an individual household who's supposed to receive it, they have no voice. And this system that we are creating gives them voice. I will end with my own journey about what it takes, or what I realized it took to make a difference with one of the technologies that I built. This was the world map in 2005. It began somewhere in the Atlantic, ended somewhere in the Pacific, like we used to say at Google, and the rest of the world was dark. And the reason was that it cost approximately $15 to map a kilometer of a road using GPS trucks in those days. So I came up with a simple idea that, look, satellite imagery, let's build a little computational geometry tool on top of the satellite imagery. And when you do that, and you solve the spam problem using a little bit of machine learning, and you open it up to people, people might map. And people in Google said, no, they won't. You're smoking something. People are not going to create world maps just because you want them to. And we tried it anyway, and it worked. So this video you're seeing in front of you, I'll play it again, is this small city, in south of India called Madurai. And what you're seeing is a time lapse of, snapshot of the maps of that city. When we released MapMaker, people just took 5 months and mapped it entirely by themselves. And all of the maps you see on Google Maps today in India, and all of the maps you see on Google Maps in 187 developing and emerging countries happened this way, with 60 people helping from Google and thousands of people around the world mapping their cities and towns and villages and so on. And the world, 5 years later, looked like this on a map. I took out the maps of the world that were already mapped, but these were the maps that our user generated in 5 years. And it mapped about 3 billion people more than the billion who were already mapped. And it had enormous impact. The another interesting insight about creating a public resource is it has unintended positive consequences that you might imagine. I had not imagined that George Clooney will use our maps and enable South Sudan's succession to be peaceful, probably one of the few peaceful successions in Africa's history. And I had not imagined that the UN would and other governments would use our maps for disaster relief. I had no idea that disaster reliefs needed maps as badly as they did. And this is a letter the UN sent back after floods happened in Pakistan, where 15 million people were displaced, about 10% of the country, and 10% of the landmass was flooded. And they took our maps because interior Pakistan had no maps. And they sent us back a letter 3 months later saying that of the 4.2 million people that they were able to help and rescue, 800,000 people would not have received relief, 250,000 lives would not have been saved but for the maps that the people of Pakistan built. Here's the thing, right? It was 5 engineers that, well, 2 of us and then 5 more joined us later who built and launched MapMaker. My journey was done, but the technical journey was done in 2008. The problems began for me in 2008 because there was a corporate battle saying that, look, this is not the right way to do maps. And I was fired 3 times, and the project was cancelled 6 times, and it was probably the hardest thing I had to do to keep making sure that this project succeeded. And the very people I fought, I had to forgive, and they had to forgive me, to the point where I could step away from the project in 2012 after making sure that the world would remain mapped forever. And during that period, I had to go through probably one of the toughest times personally. I would wake up at 6 in the morning and go to work and come back at 9 in the night because I was fighting not just for building the technology but also fighting corporate issues. For 7 days of the week, except on Sunday afternoons, I would not see my daughter awake. And one day my daughter asked me, why do you work so hard? And she was 5 years old, and I told her so I could buy you toys because I didn't know how to answer it. And 1 week later, she thought about it all week and came back and told me she doesn't want any more toys. I realized at that point that sacrifice is not giving away what is surplus to you. Sacrifice is giving up what is very dear to you. And my sacrifice is nothing compared to the sacrifice of the person you see in front of you. His name is C.N.R. Nair. When MapMaker launched, he took it upon himself to map all of rural Kerala. And rural Kerala became the first rural part of the emerging world to become fully mapped because of this one person. He made 160,000 contributions to the map himself, and he got youngsters all around Kerala to map Kerala. And what I did not realize, in that 4 years he did this, he was suffering with cancer. And he passed away recently, and he is one of my heroes. We technologists need to understand that the world will rally up behind us if we create resources for public good. And his sacrifice and my sacrifice are nothing compared to the sacrifice that these 200 million people go through every day. Have you ever wondered why, when we sit in our fancy car and go through a basti in a slum in Bombay or Bangalore, that we don't get lynched? It is astonishing to me that the generosity of the people, where people who have lost children are living to diarrhea or dengue or other diseases that we could have helped prevent, are not coming out of their houses and lynching us. Even though the cost of the car you're driving in alone would probably save hundreds of lives in that village in that year. When Martin Luther King visited India after Gandhi passed away, he stayed in Bombay House for 2 nights, and then he went around the city and he came back and he had this one singular insight. He said Gandhi could have happened only in India. And that insight is probably one of the most powerful insights of the modern world. In many ways, the world-changing effects that are going to come, many of them can only be born in India because of the extraordinary generosity of these billion people and the other 5 billion people on whose shoulders we build this modern planet. And I'll leave you with Gandhi's words. which is to fight hard, walk hard, but do not fight the people, fight the cause. And if we do that, and if we do it solely for the purpose of people, I believe we will transform the civilization in this generation. Thank you.